Well, I'm going to talk to you about an interesting subject for me. It's to imagine if Charles Darwin was living now in the 21st century, what would he think? If he knew what we now know about the state of science, would he still be a believer in evolution? That's a strange question for me to ask. Why do I ask it? The reason is because I think Charles Darwin was actually quite an honest thinker. I believe he was a lot more honest about where the evidence would lead than many modern-day evolutionists. I used to be an evolutionist myself. As a committed Christian, I believed God used evolution, though I had not thought much about it. I had read the Bible before, of course. I grew up in a Christian home believing that the Bible was the truth, and I believed that creation was part of His Word. But I embraced evolutionary thinking at age 17, not much older than most of you here, because I was taught it in school by a very good biology teacher. And along with that evolutionary view, I went to university to study zoology and geology, which is all full of millions of years of evolution. And I fully expected to be shown more and more evidence to support that point of view. I was very surprised to discover that there were many holes in the structure, many gaps in the knowledge, and many big problems with the theory. And to cut a long story short, I changed my mind and I started to believe again in creation. Did that mean I had to ignore science? No. As I hope to show you, it was because of science that I started to doubt evolution. And I think Darwin would also today have some doubts. It's not just an issue of science, though. I'm going to focus on science, and you might want to ask questions about the science, but it's also a controversy, it's a debate. Why? Because this theory of evolution is an alternative point of view about where you came from as a human being. Not just where the animals came from, or the plants, or this world, or this universe, but where you came from. Are you related to animals, or were you made in the image of God? That makes a difference to many things. If you believe, as I do, the Bible is the Word of God, it gives us an account of creation. It gives us a perfect world. It describes a world that was very good. And then, when you look at the Bible's history, you see that there's something called the fall happened. And then there was a terrible flood, destroying the whole world. Those events are believed to be true history by Jesus and the New Testament writers. That worldview connects to creation, but evolutionary thinking, millions of years, when you start to add that into the Bible somehow, it's very difficult to do, but if you try to add that in, it cuts between the two. You see, Christian faith, the worldview that is developed from a Christian understanding, it sits on a foundation. And that foundation requires a literal history. And that history is given us in the book of Genesis. And so it's very important to understand that this subject is not just an interesting discussion of science. It's also about ultimate origins. Where did morality come from? If you believe there are absolute standards of right and wrong, where did that come from? Did God create human beings in His image and give rules about how we should live? Or did we evolve our sense of morality, of right and wrong? It's an interesting question. It's a very important question. Well, it's interesting to see some of the statistics in the last few years, both in your country, in the Netherlands, in my country, the UK, and around the world. And you can see this for yourself. I'm not going to read the Dutch, but 10 countries were surveyed, and people were asked, what do you think should be taught in science lessons? And lots of people
more than 50% thought that there should be alternatives to evolution taught in science lessons. This isn't in Christian schools. This isn't a survey of Christians. It's across the populations of these European countries. In Britain, surprisingly, 60% of people, and it's a very godless country these days, 60% of people thought the alternatives to evolution should be taught in science lessons. That would include creationism, which simply means taking the Bible as history, and intelligent design, which some of you will have heard about, which acknowledges that says that there's a designer, but doesn't say who or what the designer is. So, a Muslim or a person who believes in intelligent aliens from outer space planting the earth with life, they could believe in some form of intelligent design. But they don't decide to say who he is or to claim that it's the God of the Bible. But here's the point. People think there should be a room for teaching those different points of view. So that means that even 150 years after Charles Darwin, when only one view has been taught in many schools, not true of your school, but true of most schools in most European countries, only one view has been taught, and it's the evolutionary view. There are still lots of unconvinced people. And why is that? Well, I think it's because the scientific support for evolution is very poor. It is held to as a belief, not because it's strongly supported by science. Here's an interesting picture of a man trying to shut a door. Light's coming through the door, and he's trying to keep the light out. And what that's trying to picture is someone who is closing the door on the very possibility of intelligent design, the very possibility of a God who might create. There's no question that some people are uncomfortable with the idea that there might be a God who they are accountable to for how they live, a God who would set the rules. And this quotation that you can see here is from the most respected science journal in the world, called Nature. He says, even if everything you're looking at, all the data and all the things from science, even if that's telling you there's an intelligent designer, you can't have that. Why not? Because we've decided that science is not about those things. We've made science something that's to do with natural processes only. You can't have any supernatural God. Well, that's just prejudice. That's bias. And that's not science. If you were to speak to scientists 200 years ago, you would find that many of them were believers in God, and most of them believed in creation and believed the Bible was the Word of God. That includes most of the great scientists of the past, like Isaac Newton, Johannes Kepler, Michael Faraday, and many other people who were the fathers of their scientific disciplines. They were like the people who we look to, who we build on the foundation they laid in those sciences. They were creation-believing men and women. But people today have said you can't have supernatural explanations in science. Let me explain something quickly. We are talking about origins science, historical science. We're not dealing with the experiments you do in a laboratory in school, or that I did when I was a cancer research scientist for 9 years. That's happening in the present. We measure something or observe something because we're testing an idea. We do some experiments and we can get some results, and we can decide whether our idea, our hypothesis is correct or not. That's real science. But we're not dealing with that kind of science. We're thinking about, where did the world come from? Where did all the biology come from? Where did all the animals and plants come from in the beginning? That's a different question. We cannot put that under a microscope. We can't do experiments on the past. We can't even repeat the past. And we certainly can't observe it because we can't go back in a time machine. So it's a different kind of science. And therefore your worldview, the way you and I see the world, is very important. It will influence how you do science. It will influence how you do historical or origin science. Imagine some letters. You can see them there. It's a piece of evidence. What does it mean? Well, a person looking at this evidence with a belief in evolution, certainly anyone who believes in atheism is not going to believe in God. Okay? Now, not all evolutionists are atheists, of course. I told you I was once a Christian evolutionist. But here's an atheist, and the atheist says there's definitely no such thing as God. The atheist says this is God is nowhere. The atheist is convinced that is a fact of science. But it isn't a fact, it's their interpretation, it's their perspective. A different person, equally intelligent, equally honest, it could also be a person with lots of qualifications, sees the same evidence, but sees instead God is now here. Because their glasses are different. I don't mean the ones that we actually wear, some of us. I mean a picture for how we see the world. How you see the world depends on how you think. And how you think and what you believe depends on what you have been taught at a foundational level when you were young and through your education. We all believe things because we have been told them by other people and we've read them in books. Isn't that right? Nothing you believe or I believe came to us by floating into our minds from the space around us. We read it or we were taught it. If you think about that, it means that you need to know whether what you have been taught is reliable. Can you trust it? Can you be sure about it? When you're very young, you just accept it by faith. But when you get older, you can put those things to the test. That's being an adult. It's part of real life. Now, Charles Darwin was an interesting man. He did a lot of testing of the world around him. He did lots of observation. He was a very interesting man. And some of the things he wrote about, I totally agree with. I think he was very right about lots of what he wrote. But his big idea, which said that all living things are related millions of years ago to a common ancestor, that is what I disagree with. And that's what I want us to think about. What would Darwin think if he was alive now and he knew about how little knowledge has been gained about where the first cell came from? He imagined in a warm little pond life getting together from simple chemicals. He would have hoped that all these years later people would have a better idea about the origin of life from chemicals. We'll look at that. Secondly, what would he have thought if he had known how quickly rocks can form? Just how quickly that can happen. Not requiring millions of years. Number 3, what would he have thought if he knew just how quickly fossils could form? Maybe you haven't thought about that, but fossils can form very quickly. What about number 4? How rare those in-between fossils are. Sometimes they're called missing links or intermediate fossils, something that's showing a step between a simple and a more complicated structure, something in the middle, something part way along the line. Those things must be completely filling the rocks, Darwin thought. He said that I don't see them now in geology. We can't see them yet, but he predicted they would be found. Well, have they been found? I believe if he was alive today, he would be very surprised. And also, what would he have thought if he had known about cells and molecules? In Darwin's day, there was very little knowledge about what we call a cell. It was something they could look at under a microscope, but they knew there was a bit of chemistry there. They could see a dark structure in the middle, which they called a nucleus, but they knew very little about the cell. Nowadays, you can study your entire life, the chemistry going on in a cell. And you can write books, even an introductory book that you would use for your first year of cell biology at a university, and it's just an introduction, is about 1,400 pages of small type and very complex diagrams. And that's just the first year of university. It is a much more complex structure than he thought. And finally, what would he think if he knew that there are limits to the amount of change that can take place in living things? Animals can change, plants can change, but he thought the change was limitless. These are things to look at. And I can only give you a tiny bit on each subject. We haven't got millions of years in this time. We've just got a short time. So the first one is, how did life start? Where did the first cell come from? And I'm not going to tell you much about this. I'm just going to give you a quotation from a top scientist called Andy Knoll. And who is he? Well, he's a professor of evolutionary biology at probably the most prestigious university in the United States, Harvard. What does he say? You can read it for yourself. Just give you a few seconds to read that. And you can see that I've highlighted those words 3 times. He says, we don't know. Very honest. It's very different from what you hear on popular scientific programs, isn't it? David Attenborough, heard of him? He's famous all over the world, in the English-speaking world especially. And his wildlife programs are characterized by these words. We know that. We know that millions of years ago this happened. We know that the ancestor of this animal was, and then he describes it. That's bluff. That's faith. It's deceiving people into thinking that there is all this evidence to support what he says we know. The truth is very different. And here, this man says, we don't know how life started. That is up to date. That is exactly where the science of the origin of life is at in 2014. There is no idea at all about how life started. It might have happened, you could argue, but it's not scientific to say that we know how the first cell came into being. We have no idea. And this is from 2009. It's 5 years ago. I want to give you just another example of a quotation. This magazine, New Scientist, is read all over the world. They have lots of ideas, and you can read a few of them in this quotation. Ideas of where life might have got started. But having ideas is not science. It's not a crime to have ideas. It's speculation. It's fun to think about, perhaps. But it's not science. How did it begin? We just don't know. So there's not much point in me spending a lot of time giving you detailed lecture on chemistry or biochemistry when the world's leading scientists admit they have no clue. Darwin would have been surprised at that, I can assure you. He would have also been surprised at just how much evidence there is in our world today of rapid formation of rocks. And I don't just mean layers of sedimentary rock laid down by water, sand, mud, and lime to form sandstone, mudstone, limestone, and the fossils in them. I mean hot rocks, igneous rocks, things that have come out of a volcano which are supposed to take tens or hundreds of millions of years to cool down. When I was studying geology at university in the 1980s, I was told that when you had a very large amount of rock, that it would take a few 100 million years, or at least tens of millions of years, for that very big amount of rock to cool down from the molten state to form crystals and to become completely hard and cool. Do you know that people now say in the journals, in the secular journals, that if you have a lot of water present, it can only take 10 years. It's a big difference from 10 million or 100 million to a decade. Well, here's an island that was only a year old when the pictures were taken. This island is in the North Atlantic. It's called Surtsey. It's about 70 kilometers south of Iceland. And in 1962, eruptions began and volcanic activity at the surface of the ocean started to produce an island. And that island already had features after 1 year that geologists expected needed tens or hundreds of millions of years after 1 year. After just 3 or 4 years, it had cooled down enough for bare rock to be colonized by birds, seabirds. Seabirds left behind their excrement, their guano, and in that sometimes there were seeds. The seeds grew in the soil that was there, really, and that meant that plants could then become established and they could pollinate from the insects brought in on the winds, and in no time at all, in a lifetime only, you have an ecosystem on the island of Surtsey. Not only was the geology very rapid, and that would have surprised Darwin, but the biology was rapid. It's astonishing even to me when I consider the things I was taught at university. This happened not in millions of years, not even in a human lifetime, but within 20 years of the island forming from nothing. That does not prove the kind of thing that I believe as a Christian about creation and a worldview from Genesis with a time frame of thousands of years. But it's much more consistent with that than people often think. Charles Darwin would have been surprised at this kind of thing. I could give you many other examples of things like that. He would have been very surprised to find how many fossils are being discovered with soft tissues present. I know that from his own words. I've read Darwin's literature, I've read his letters, and he made a prediction that you could never find a fossil which only had soft parts, because you need the hard parts. That's what gets preserved. But we do find soft-bodied creatures made as fossils. This is an octopus fossil from Lebanon. And there were 5 of them found in those rocks in Lebanon, published in 2009. They were so well preserved that you could see all 8 tentacles, all the suckers on the tentacles, and even the ink in the ink sac could be taken and used to write with. That's quite well preserved, isn't it? They expected that something like this would quickly, if it was buried and it died, quickly it would become a mess, it would become rotting, it would rot, it would become just a slimy mess very quickly. But if it's buried quickly in water and mud that has the right minerals present to replace those soft parts with mineral content, then you have a replica of the soft-bodied creature in the stone. That can only happen if they're buried quickly. That's the only way you could make a fossil like that. You may know that people are finding fossils of dinosaur bones where some of the material hasn't yet been changed to stone. Have you come across that? Have you heard of that? So this is a T-Rex bones. This is meat from inside a T-Rex bone. And this was the first example, published in 2005. They even found blood vessels with liquid blood inside them, and in the blood were blood cells, and in the blood cells was hemoglobin. Since that time, they found many other examples of soft, stretchy material inside bones of dinosaurs and many other creatures. Bones that are supposed to be many tens of millions of years old. No scientist has any idea how that could possibly last that long. So the evidence is much more easy to understand if you believe the Earth is thousands of years old. It's impossible to explain if the Earth is millions of years old. Darwin would have been very surprised by such things. And I believe, because he was an honest inquirer, I strongly believe he would have been very reluctant to continue to push his theories so strongly. I'm not saying he would have dropped it immediately, but I think he would have been very, very reluctant to continue to push it so strongly. All of the people who've written about Charles Darwin's life, the biographers, have said that the illnesses he suffered from were because he was worried about whether his theory was correct or not. And he was worried about the impact of his ideas on human beings in the society. He thought that if people embraced his ideas, they would probably reject the Bible and reject God. Well, he was right about that. Lots of people did. I think he would have been given a lot of thought if he'd seen this sort of thing. Charles Darwin was convinced that there would be those intermediate fossils, those things which are part one creature, part another. If you have an animal that's a dinosaur and it's going to evolve into a bird, that's what lots of people teach, then it's going to take millions of years to develop wings and feathers for flying. Obviously, not going to happen quickly. That would be a miracle. And we're wanting a scientific explanation, not a miracle, if we're evolutionists. So this would happen over a long time, and you would expect to find lots of examples of animals that showed this process in action, developing wings and feathers. You would expect the same for animals that have gone from a 4-footed land animal back into the ocean to make whales and dolphins and porpoises. It wouldn't happen quickly. There would be some evidence of it happening over tens or hundreds of millions of years. But many paleontologists, the people who are experts on the fossils, admit, and this is their trade secret, they admit that these things are very rare. Stephen Jay Gould, you may not have heard of him, but in the 20th century, he was considered probably the leading expert and the leading popularizer of evolution in North America. And Stephen Jay Gould was at Harvard University. He was a Marxist, so he was not a Christian by any means. He was also a professor of the history of science and a top expert on fossils. And he said what you can read there. These things are rare. They're very rare. They're so rare that we have to preserve our belief in evolution, even though we never see these things happening. You have to have faith. And, Stephen Jay Gould was being honest. Here is a picture from an evolutionary textbook. And here you see red bars that represent one kind of dinosaur. The line at the top is the present day. As you come down the diagram from the top to the bottom, you're coming back in time over millions of years. And what they're saying is, in the rocks we find one kind of animal, one kind of dinosaur, and then we find it a bit higher up in the rocks and a bit higher up, and that red bar represents finding that fossil of that animal at different layers in the rock. But you can see that although there are many different types of dinosaurs found in the fossil record, there's no red lines linking each other. none of the red bars is linked by red lines. Why not? Because the evolutionists know there are no missing links. They know that there are no intermediates between the different dinosaurs. That's why they're called missing links, because the links are still missing. And that's from the evolutionary source. So you can still believe in evolution, but you have to draw lines between them when there is no actual evidence from the fossils to show that. You might have seen these kinds of pictures. You have a picture of an animal at the top that's 4-footed, and gradually over time it's supposed to develop into an ancient whale at the bottom of the picture, and they give them these strange names. The second one down, Ambulocetus, means walking whale. Does it look like a whale to you? Well, that's what the scientists who found it thought it might be. And then you've seen pictures like this. An ape on the left-hand side gradually becoming upright and developing into an upright naked ape, as they call us, a human being. But even top evolutionists admit this kind of picture is an illusion, because they know that there is not a lot of fossil evidence to support all the steps from the ape to the human. You've seen these kind of pictures. That's what we mean by evolution. That's what people mean. They mean that apes and humans have a common ancestor. They mean that land animals and sea animals have a common ancestor over time. But when you hear the word evolution being used, it's used in a different way as well, and this makes it confusing. So in the textbooks that some schools use, in the popular science programs, in the popular magazines, you will hear claims like this: someone sees evolution happening before their very eyes. It's a fact. And they're talking about changes in butterflies or moths, or they're talking about the finches that Darwin saw on the Galapagos Islands. They perhaps have gone, there's two people, Peter and Rosemary Grant, biologists, they've gone back to the Galapagos Islands, and over many years they've been looking at those finches that Darwin saw, those birds. And on each island they have looked at the length of the bird's beak, and they have measured them over many years. And do you know what they found? The length of the beak changes. It evolves. But then a few years later, it might have got longer and it's gone back shorter again. It's part of a cycle. It gets a bit longer, a bit shorter. This isn't evolution. It's just changing in length of the beaks of the finches. And all the finches are still able to breed together anyway. So whether you're looking at finches or moths or butterflies or changes in domestic animals, these are changes within one family, one kind. But what are people thinking of when they hear the word evolution? I see evolution happening. Trust me, I'm a scientist. They're thinking of this kind of thing, aren't they? Isn't that true? So you've got to be careful. Evolution's being used in two different ways. Charles Darwin saw evidence for the small changes that we can all see today and that scientists can see today. But he imagined that if you had millions of years, you could see you could have a cell becoming a scientist. Yes? You could have an amphibian turning into a reptile, turning into a bird. That's what he imagined. So we need to be careful that we don't get deluded by the evidence. This man, you won't have heard of him, but Henry Gee edits the top journal Nature. He's the main editor of the most respected science journal in the world, which is committed to a belief in evolution. Just look at what he says here. Read the whole thing, because this is quite an amazing statement that he makes. He's really saying, when you dig up a fossil, it doesn't have a label telling you how old it is. He's also saying that you cannot take a line of fossils and link them together in a meaningful way. He's saying that the line of ape to human is just an illusion. He says that all of those lines of fossils where you pretend that you've got birds evolving from reptiles, where you say you've got land animals evolving into sea creatures, amphibians evolving from fish that have crawled out of the sea, he's saying we can believe it, it can be a hypothesis, but we can't say that it's science. What we're really saying is you can have it and it can be fun and it's amusing and it's even a bedtime story, but we cannot say that it's scientific. That's an evolutionist saying that, not me. Now, it's frustrating for him when people like me use his words and tell people like you. Because this isn't at a popular magazine. This is in a serious science journal. And they don't want this kind of thing to be broadcast to ordinary people like you and me. They're frustrated. But that's the truth of it. Here is an example of a creature found as a fossil. This is the picture you see, the sort of picture you see in the popular magazines. As I said to you, Henry Gee thinks this is bad science. But you see that they found a new fossil right in the middle, a new species, about 2 million years old, they say. And this was found in South Africa in 2010. They actually found quite a bit of the bone of this ape-like creature called Australopithecus sediba from 2 different individuals. Now, there's a lot more bone there than you would normally expect. This is actually from the science paper, but what you see itself is misleading because this is a picture of ape-like fossils on a background that makes them look like they're upright. Apes don't walk around generally fully upright. They walk around on all fours. And everything we see from the skeleton shows it was a 4-footed creature. But the man who found it, Lee Berger, thought it was very important and it was in the world's headlines. Another expert called Carl Zimmer has written books on evolution. He's committed to belief in evolution. He said that it wasn't a missing link. Definitely not a missing link. Who do you believe? The person who says it is a missing link or the other evolutionists who said it's definitely not? I can assure you all of these things are controversial. And Charles Darwin would have been unimpressed with the claims of that being a missing link. He would have been surprised if he saw what's inside cells. Cells are very complicated things inside. And for Charles Darwin, the cell was like a black box. It was a mysterious thing. When you see little machines like this walking around inside your cells, and there are others that are spinning as motors, and there are thousands of these kinds of machines. When you see this kind of thing, it tells you that there must be a lot of programming of information underlying that. Do you understand? If you're looking at complicated things like this, they didn't come from nowhere. There must be a lot of very complicated software programming in the cell to build this kind of hardware. Of course, it's a computer animation, but it's based on the latest research. This little molecule that you see here is carrying a bag of proteins from where they are manufactured in the cell to where they are going to be assembled into something like a structural protein or an enzyme or something like that. It's walking along a roadway in the cell made of something called microtubules. Each step it takes is so small that if it walked 125,000 times, took 125,000 steps, it would have walked just 1 millimeter. Very, very complicated. And that is evidence of sophisticated, intelligent programming. Some people claim that this is evidence of unplanned, unguided, random, accidental mistakes in the DNA software over millions of years. You have to have a lot of faith to believe that, because nothing in our experience tells us that unplanned, unguided, stupid mistakes make a software program like Windows or Microsoft's or the Apple operating system, or that can build a computer. It requires a great amount of intelligence to make these things. Charles Darwin, I believe, would have been very impressed with that. And he would have wanted an explanation, because he always wanted an explanation for things. As a Christian, I am not going to apologize for saying that I believe this Psalm 139 is a good description of how we should appreciate the world we're living in. Here you have a statement that says, I'm going to praise God because I'm wonderfully made. That is a sensible reaction to the things that we see. The alternative is to say, things are wonderfully made and it just happened by itself for no reason, for no purpose. I think that requires great faith. Charles Darwin did not know that there were definite limits to the amount of change that could take place. He thought that if you had enough time, the changes in the pigeons he observed, because he used to do pigeon breeding, the changes in the finches he had seen, the changes in the tortoises he had seen, which were very small, but he said if you have millions of years, then there's no limit to the amount of change that can take place. But we know that's not true. A bit of time after Darwin, people decided mutations were the answer. These mistakes when cells divide, they could create the new information. And this meant that maybe there was a way of rescuing Darwin. And so for some time, since the 1930s and 40s, so we're talking of about 70 years now, for about that much time, people think that they have an answer. But you can see that this lady is not convinced. She has just died recently, but she was one of the most well-known biologists when I was at university, a committed evolutionist. But she knew that mutations don't help. Those are mistakes when a cell divides. It's like making a copy of all that information in the DNA, and there will be an occasional mistake. But those things aren't useful. They don't create something useful that evolution needs. Instead, they cause disease. And lots of diseases are known in human beings alone. Thousands of diseases. It says here 1,000, but actually this is an underestimate. Many mistakes are known that cause cancer. And these are bad things. When you see this fly, you're not looking at a creature that's got an advantage. You're seeing a creature that has been born without wings, and it is now at a disadvantage. The mutation that it had switched off the information for making its wings. It can't find food, it can't escape, and it's not going to survive in the wild. So what mutations usually do is they get rid of the weak. The animal with a mutation is going to suffer. So when I look at the Bible and I see that God made different kinds of animals, it doesn't say he made species, that's a scientific word, but he made kind. It's a bigger category, maybe like the family of dogs, or the family of people, or the family of rose plants, or the family of horses. There's a lot of variety in each family, but there are limits to the amount of change that can take place. There is no evidence scientifically that you can go from something that is not a dog into a dog over time. So let me summarize this talk. Who is really hiding their head in the sand? Is it the Christian who believes the Bible, believes that God miraculously created all things? Or is it the person who's convinced that evolution must be true, Well, ask yourself, does the evidence support evolution? And I believe that in these 150 or so years since Charles Darwin wrote that famous book, The Origin of Species, the more science we have gathered, the more difficult it is for thinking people to believe in evolution. I know many people still believe it, but that's because they have a desire for an alternative to God. Read this last quotation, we're almost finished, and you can see that this man, Andrew Marr, he's a journalist in the United Kingdom, you can see that he likes Charles Darwin's idea. But he doesn't like it because of its science so much as because of the way it frees us to think differently about the world we're in. Charles Darwin's theory of evolution questions everything we thought we knew. He means everything we knew from the Bible, the culture we grew up in a Christian country. Now, he says, we have a different way of thinking. Where do we come from? Who are we as human beings? Why do we behave as we do? What is right and wrong? What is the origin of our morality? Where does that come from? Charles Darwin's idea changes everything. That's the key to understanding why so many people still believe evolution, even though the scientific evidence is not strongly supporting it. So the worldview you have matters, and I hope you have the biblical Christian worldview. Now, I've gone over time. The talk's formally over. I'm sorry, I was aware it was being videoed. Does anybody want to ask a quick question?